Thank you for inviting me. And of course, my paper will be a bit different from the other ones, but let's see. Staroсть не радость. Old age is no joy, goes an old Russian proverb frequently cited also today. In the late imperial period, from about 1880, this saying obtained a new actuality as the Russian society largely ignored its aging population. The upheaving changes of the pre-revolutionary decades had undermined their position and security, deflecting attention away from their specific problems and needs. The low status of the elderly was probably made worse by the intellectual ethos of this era, with its panegyricization of newness and its longing to break away from stagnated ways of living. On a cultural level, this time was dominated by dreams about the destruction of the old world and the birth of a brand new one, and above all, by a yearning to create a perfect human, a super being who, based on ideas of immortality and rejuvenation, would stay forever young. Such speculations staked everything on the future, establishing a cultural setting that disregarded the past and the obsolete, including the country's aging population, and initiating a cult of youth that became an intrinsic part of the ideological and political landscape, both before and after the Bolshevik divide. Two preeminent individuals, however, starkly opposed the epoch's idealization of youth and what is referred to by Margaret Gillett as a script of decline, the negative and prejudiced societal attitudes towards the state of aging. These were the zoologist and Nobel Prize winner Ilya Mechnikov, who in 1904 coined the term gerontology, and the writer Lev Tolstoy, who in his last 30 years became a living manifestation of the trope of the wise old man. In an atmosphere marked by what Kathleen Woodward would later characterize as our culture's gerontophobia, these two thinkers gave old age, not youth, a privileged position as a fundamental dimension of human existence. In this regard, they both rejected Shakespeare's uttering to the lips of the decrepit King Lear, "Age is unnecessary." Quite on the contrary, to Mechnikov and Tolstoy, old age was most necessary as a condition of extraordinary importance. The long life, as Helen Small would call her groundbreaking book about the ethics of aging, was therefore to these two Russians always the good life as well. Their strategies for a fulfilling aging, albeit, were clashing. Mechnikov saw modern medicine as the solution to a good life. Senescence was to be made better by science. To Tolstoy, on the other hand, and given his extreme hostility towards the medical profession, senescence was an entirely different paradigm. It was a sphere of self-discovery and a place for spiritual and moral seeking along the lines from Socrates and Cicero. Accordingly, an ideal old age had little to do with medical and hygienic procedures, as Tolstoy repeatedly pointed out in his highly antagonistic polemics with Mechnikov. The programmatic contrast between these two contemporaries and the divergent stories they tell about how to have a good aging in Russia at the turn of the 20th century is an intriguing topic, well worth pursuing. In this paper, though, I will concentrate on the Tolstoyan angle with its markedly anti-scientific, anti-positivist bias. The biggest surprise in a man's life is old age. I never thought it could be so attractive. Tolstoy once contended, indicating the significance he attached to this stage. To him, senescence was to some degree what Max Weber would call Weltflucht. It was an archaizing withdrawal from the modern world into a realm of introspection and solitude, inspired by medieval Christian Orthodox hagiography and classical Stoic antiquity. Negating the cultural development of Russian modernism, the aging writer dreamt of living in hermeneutic retreat, or even better, to roam the earth as a pilgrim, free from the bonds of bodily lust and carnality. The late years thus presented an exclusive chance to implement the ideal of a chaste life. And as such, it was a way to escape the moral destruction the author found ingrained in sexual desire, leading to a new freedom and also offering a time to prepare for the final exit. Old age was vital to Tolstoy precisely because of its closeness to the ending and the value of a life increase, as he claimed it, in inverse square proportion to one's distance to death. In aging, the human was given a possibility to come to terms with mortality, making senescence into almost a method for mastering the fear of dying. And also a lesson in the ars moriendi. This was an art form his contemporaries, as he would have it, had largely forgotten, and in his novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, he shows in shocking detail the fearful consequences of such forgetfulness. To Tolstoy, the essence of senescent strivings were ultimately a quest for what he regarded from his Rousseauian and pre-hermeneutic position as the authentic and core self. He always, but especially in his later years, after his famous crisis around 1880, explores the themes of identity, death, and aging, as we find it in his artistic authorship, but also in his extensive amount of life writing. Diaries, autobiographies, and letters. To some extent, Tolstoy's quest, as we can see from these writings, takes the form of a traditional narrative, in which he aims to create what can be called a hagiographic dialectics of his own story. In this idealized construction, childhood is a positive stage, late youth and middle years a negative one, while senescence is a synthesizing period, a model that celebrates the third age. The third age is supposed to be a harmonious culmination of a lifespan in which childhood memories are reactivated, contributing to a higher unity of one's best experiences. Senescence, as Tolstoy saw it, thus occupied the highest metaphysical level. It was the peak of individual growth, an elevated universe, actually reminding one of the recent theory of gyrotranscendence as formulated by Lev Tolstoy. Typically, to Tolstoy, the latter days were particularly valuable, since they allow old people to detach themselves from their former being and enter into a state of mind out of time. And because of this timelessness, old men could incarnate the most sublime mode of existence and be, and I quote, the bearers of the moral progress of mankind. This formulation demonstrates certainly the fundamental importance attached to the elderly male whose wisdom the ethical development of society allegedly depended upon. But it also demonstrates how, in the old writer's misogynic universe, elderly women were brutally excluded from this sphere of senescent sublimity, a provoking topic of inequality that cannot be followed here. In Tolstoy's construction of an ideal old age, he stages himself along hagiographic lines as a lay saint and a spiritual leader, steadily turning away from the world towards new depths of inner clarity. More often than not, though, this tale breaks out of the lofty frame it has set for itself, digressing into ambivalent anti-narratives. Not least did these digressions threaten to undermine Tolstoy's seeking for a continuous and essential identity. This seeking was frustrated not least through his construing of continually new self-analysis and self-portraits. Although he once asserted to have glimpsed a connection between himself at 8 years old and at 82, he was otherwise unable to link the different versions of himself. He could hardly find, for example, any link between himself as a contented pater familias of the 1860s and the senescent ascetic of his latest period. A situation creating, one could argue, a collision between competing discourses of selfhood. Regardless of his belief in an innermost and unified I, he therefore saw the self not only as a whole, but even more as fluid, often comparing man to a tumultuous river, always changing course and character. Furthermore, he was not able to bring biographical time under his control. Like many elderly, Tolstoy discovered that he was defined by other people or by the alien gaze, as Simone de Beauvoir would have it, in the role of an old man. An objectified identity he did not recognize, resulting in a splitting of the personality in relation to his own self-perception. Discrepancies such as these make his old life script in all its anachronistic strangeness and its futile insistence upon wholeness and harmony, both intriguing and pertinent for readers today. Discrepancies also characterize his late life on a personal level, further destabilizing his exalted construction of a good aging. From one point of view, we have the myth of Tolstoy as the great elder. He is the count who, in accordance with his teaching of Christian anarchism, so-called Tolstoyanism, had withdrawn from his aristocratic milieu to live in silent and solitary retreat. He was, as it were, a homeless between his own, after having transferred the ownership of his properties to his wife, and also after having made a break with his previous literary career, rejecting as corruptive abominations his former masterworks like Anna Karenina and War and Peace. In addition, based on his newfound ascetic ideas, he advocated withdrawal from family ties, the necessity to stop procreation and the imperative of celibacy, both outside of and within marriage. But, notwithstanding the old Tolstoy's archaizing ideas of dissociation from all normal, so to say, human relations, ideas harking back to contemplative cultural patterns of classical antiquity and medieval hagiography, he was still to an exceptional degree subsumed in the discourses of modernity. And his provoking person and opinions, by their sheer otherness, were constantly figuring in the midst of the period's intellectual debates. As such, his declarations of disengagement from society were promptly followed by his re-engagement. Through ferocious prophetic criticism, he raged against what he took to be moral violations, both in Russia and elsewhere. His uncompromising voice, unable to be quiet, despite his longing for the mode of silence, often created difficulties in relation to the authorities. For example, his iconoclastic attacks on the institutions of church and state in his very last novel, Resurrection, resulted in his scandalous excommunication by the Holy Synod in 1901. For his nearest surroundings, Tolstoy's unpredictable behavior, colliding with the old man persona of humility and caritas that he strove to write himself into, generated deep problems. His endeavor to live out a serene, reclusive senescence was therefore hampered by conflicts, creating frictions between the idealized biography of the wise Senescence and the real one, disturbing the solemn hagiographic tale of his elderly days. In this respect, most conspicuous is the fact that while he renounced some of the aristocrats' privileges, like formerly having no property, he still resided, although conscience-stricken, like a nobleman, in his stately houses, with thoroughbred horses, submissive family members and followers, plus countless servants. To be sure, he wanted to identify with the people, occasionally ploughing with his laborers in the fields and dressing like a peasant, à la moujik. Yet his wife sarcastically notes in a diary that her husband wore silk underwear beneath his coarse peasant clothing. And despite his profound aversion towards modern medicine, he had his own private physicians, attending at all hours to his every need. The author even had what can be called his own court painter, the eminent artist Ilya Repin, who painstakingly documented his last decades, helping to create the mythology of Tolstoy as Russia's spiritual and even barefooted Tsar. Also, with regard to the ideal of the abstemious elder, forsaking bodily pleasures to save his eternal soul, Tolstoy's personal life grievously interfered. While he increasingly insisted on chastity and conveyed an anti-procreative message, he himself admitted to be a dirty, libidinous old man, unable to follow his own rules of continence. He continued to have children with his wife, altogether 13, also after his condemnation of carnal relations from the beginning of the 1880s. And his wife, on her part, feared becoming pregnant, especially after the publication of the radical anti-sexual novel The Kreutzer Sonata in 1889. And she dreaded being ridiculed by society if she once more were to bear a child to her old and allegedly celibate husband. Typically, she notes that if people knew the real love life of the seemingly abstinent prophet, they would, in her words, hurl their idol down from the pedestal upon which they had put him. Yet the most spectacular testimony of Tolstoy's precarious aging is his final outburst of energy. His flight from his home at Yasnaya Polyana in his 82nd year in an attempt to live out his dream of self-imposed exile and peregrination. The dramatic escape leading after a week on the run to Tolstoy's death on November 7, 1910, at the railway station of Astapova, from one point of view, becomes an anti-narrative, a dismissal of all pretensions on wholeness in a life-writing context. Or his departure could be interpreted as a closing of his personal story, a fulfillment at having managed to realize at last the exilic life he so longed for. His demise, though, was, ironically, not the one of stoic solitude he had envisioned, due to circumstances that clearly undermined the authoring of his own end. Because the death of Tolstoy, meant to pass in serene isolation, was transformed into a media circus, the greatest media happening in Russia up till then. The writer was dying in full publicity, beset not only by the medical expert and church dignitary he so much detested, but also by the representatives of the modern communication world, telegraphists, cameramen, photographers, and reporters, transferring his every final word and deed. Whatever symbolic significance can be read out of Tolstoy's last actions, his flight achieved an enormous impact. It was shaped into an epochal event, testifying to the extraordinary strength of the old sage and his ability to follow his convictions against all odds of geriatric infirmity and bodily decay. He gives one an appetite for growing old. Michel de Montaigne once commented of Cicero. And possibly this could be said about the aging Tolstoy as well. Notwithstanding the many idiosyncrasies of his elderly years, like his gynophobic ideas and anti-procreative views, the legacy from the old Tolstoy is an impressive one. Admittedly, his ideal hagiographic aging was something seldom realized in his own case. His restless energy and his controversial nature constantly colliding with self-inflicted demands of withdrawal and reclusion. This inconsistency, however, does not make his insistency on the unique worth of old age less important. Quite the contrary, his very unruliness and his inability to conform to his own rules of muteness and disinterest towards the world, in a certain sense make him even more remarkable in the context of old people in late imperial Russia. In a period dominated by depressing images of the voiceless and disabled old man and woman, his personality forcefully stands out, cutting quite the contra figure. And in a fin-de-siècle culture characterized by an increasing marginalization and invisibilization of the elderly, he vigorously shatters influential and demeaning stereotypes regarding old age. Moreover, to Tolstoy, aging was not a disease to be cured, and our mortality was not a medical problem to be eliminated, but rather a guide to the right living. His emphasizing of the prolongation of life, not as a time of misfortune, as Thomas Hardy would once have it, but of change, renewal, and growth, is thus a valuable corrective. It is also a challenge, and not only to the youth-promoting and anti-aging programs of contemporary Russian transhumanists, but to all anti-aging programs in our Western society, striving to different techniques to abolish death and exclude senescence from the human condition. Thank you for your attention. And here's the last picture, showing the innovative playfulness also of Tolstoy. He was one of the first in Russia to learn to ride a bicycle, and he was driving around on his Yasnaya Polyana, and all the peasants were very much afraid.